Hey everyone, this is the Shientist, and I'm gonna put forward another overview on a subject entity that is important, not just in aspects of academia and research, but generally important in helping to really add rigor to sort of one's effort and sort of commitment to particular areas of practice, and whether that's in healthcare or healthcare research or health service research, or in things like law for example, law and enforcement, or in areas of business, in areas of just focuses around areas and focuses around what sort of leads to individuals having a sense of integrity about what the kind of work and effort they're putting towards a particular area of, and I'll use this terminology quite loosely, an area of scholarship, because generally speaking, when there's commitment to add to an area of industry, whether it might be, for example, aspects of where it might be in written context, or maybe visual context, or that can be and perhaps should be referred to in some way or form as scholarship. But again, I'm using that word quite loosely, at least in part of this introduction, or this in this introduction and this sort of audio and podcast. This is on an important topic, causing raising your research profile, and this is in the LabZtorm effects series, and this is another Storm Lobostics production. So I'm going to begin with highlighting some context around at least attention to detail in at least two sections, more or less. So first, I'm going to continue a little bit from what was highlighted in at least the two previous audios. One was audios and podcasts, and one was around interprofessional collaborations, and the one before that was around how to be an effective research collaborator. So I'm going to draw on context from some of those entities that were highlighted in those two audios more particularly, but I will highlight how it is important to have a sort of an academic or semi-academic research profile to an area of sort of work as well, because even in areas of let's say, for example, in whether it's business, as in area of sort of online and online spaces, or in areas of and focuses around maybe areas of entertainment, areas of sort of technology, or areas of pharmaceutics, or around those particular generally across different industries. It's important to have a sort of academic or research profile that kind of sort of encompasses and relates to one's to an individual's background, and it's also important to highlight that the written words or the and context in that manner can and should really substantiate things, even in areas around arts and arts and culture, and definitely around I would think in areas in law and enforcement, etc. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but more the more of the understanding is going to be about how, based on the previous two audios about how to be an effective research collaborator, and also how to have and why sort of interprofessional collaborations are important. I'm going to draw on those as part of this audio and podcast. So, and I'm going to sort of draw on some experience of my own, but I'm also going to and will also once again highlight some of the works that come out from the Renal Patient Support Group, or the RPSG, because again I want to sort of draw in aspects around that particular area of healthcare, i.e. nephrology and nephrology practice, and the sciences around that. So, having a better understanding of how collaborations can be effective, or at least smarter, it stems and is perhaps the pinnacle and the underlying basis of why individuals might want to sort of highlight and ensure that they are sort of keeping in practice, keeping areas of check, keeping areas of focus in health and in other areas that might link to health, that they are in check. And to do that, it's important to have a research profile. This is important also because if there's a focus is too much, let's say for example, on images and on aspects of the visual context that perhaps many are quite used to through for example use of social media in at least how social media is used, can be used for and against us in some way, and basically having an understanding of how our peers, our colleagues, and how we could be more effective as collaborators or etc. That actually helps at least bring some enthusiasm to an individual's effort to perhaps wanting to draw on an academic stance as part of their sort of research, their profile, their profile, and stem into aspects of research, so that's to bring a bit more integrity to their work. So having a better understanding of how that could be advantageous and how can help in aspects of development and even aspects of progress, that should be understood from different industries and different sort of backgrounds, and also where there might be sort of where for example some and this is just general communication in this context, where some might have a sense of feeling of a racial disparity or discrimination, or maybe there's ignorance and things like that out there, then at least having a research profile can bring a sense of integrity and a sense of sort of wholeness to an aspect of professional development in healthcare. That is where health professionals look to raise aspects of their research profile. If it's not research specifically, then it's about continuous professional development, and that is a sort of integral in actually ensuring that there is that the individual's profile is always on upfront, and also sort of in keeping with sort of today's practices around different different areas of healthcare or health research, if that's what an individual might be into, for example. Now, having given examples around the renal patient support group, or the RPSG previously, I wanted to draw on that example again because they have maintained a sense of academic scholarship, evidencing aspects of their work throughout their throughout the time that they've been around, and since they've been since the RPSG, of the Renal Patient Support Group, was conceptualized in 2009. So there's that academic scholarship and prowess around basically focuses really around things in all areas of nephrology or nephrology practice, and also where that team, where they've been collaborative, worked and looked to highlight areas not just in adult nephrology but also in pediatric nephrology through collaborations with their sort of the equivalent of the RPSG, which is the Kidney Disease and Renal Support Group, or KDARS for kids, and the team there have presented in lots of different ways, through poster presentations, sort of oral presentations, and having context in paper publications, and so on and so forth, and they do sort of channel across at least 6 different social media platforms, which I think is pretty amazing. Now, that being said, having an understanding of sort of academic scholarship, it shouldn't feel too intimidating, though I can completely appreciate why it might be. When people look at aspects of healthcare or healthcare research, generally speaking, and the more kind of specialist or sort of focused an area of healthcare is, the more intimidating some of the writing, and even colleagues and collaborators can be, as such, can be quite intimidating. And it's probably no wonder why in some areas of the world healthcare is a little bit distraught. But that being said, the RPSG, as an example, has been looking at things from a very sort of involvement perspective since it was conceptualized and founded in 2009, and have presented works in different across different arenas and different parts of the world, and always having a focus on nephrology or kidney care practice, whether that's pediatric or adult nephrology, but also when linking in areas where our focus is that are actually quite foreign to aspects of not just nephrology being one, but healthcare generally. So, for example, those colleagues, for example, have looked at focuses around, for example, discrimination and ignorance, and putting like that sense of understanding that happens perhaps in an open form, in an open way, and sort of in the across different areas of public, and affecting, of course, public health, and linking that with nephrology, which I think is pretty amazing in its own right, because it takes a serious amount of reflecting, I think, for any team to kind of come up with efforts to, draw in examples and bridge those entities across the sort of aspects of maybe some injustices, but also aspects of disparity more generally. The thing about their work is that, and I've mentioned, for example, they channel across at least 6 different social media channels, and there isn't when and I think this has been said in one of the previous audios and podcasts as well, that wherever and whenever education is concerned, you cannot expect those who are working in that entity, around that entity, to have, like, for example, if they were using different forms of social media, to have, for example, I don't know, like 20 million followers, or 30 million or 40 or 50, etc., etc. Because even if they're kind of if there's colleagues and teams that actually focus quite rigorously in areas of healthcare, or educational aspects around, whether it be in pediatrics or young people or adults, they that doesn't that really is not a premise when it comes to raising an aspect of around the team's research profile, for example. So that being, and again, that being said, those different social media platforms inherit in one way or another, or more than one way or another, are used to by those in those industries to raise their own research profiles, or their own profiles, or and by profile I do not mean, at least in the first context, by academic scholarship and that entity. That's kind of sort of at least how those social media platforms are used and implemented, is more about image and visualization and photography and those kinds of things, for example. So the aspects around academia and what is perhaps quite evident in and around these particular industries is that first and foremost it is mainly about having a sense of sustainability in what I guess what they're passionate about, but then having that sense of rigor around what they're passionate about is not really displayed, or it might not be displayable. So for example, even if I don't know, there might be really well known, and I'm just gonna highlight this, and that is to say that there might be well known sort of celebrities who might also have sort of an academic a sense of academic rigorousness about their work and the work they do, except they can't or they do not highlight that into aspects of academic or academia and that scholarship. And what I'm saying here really and truly as part of the profile and part of sort of an individual's sort of background and sort of profile, that an element of what they're passionate about, for example, or where they want to highlight areas of compassion, should be encompassed and encircled in a focus around having a research, a sort of a research profile as well. The renal patient support group team, or the RPSG, that example has been sort of implemented, but they're not. There's nothing celebrity about the RPSG, and the same I could say. The same would be said, for example, around the kidney disease and renal support group, or KDARS for kids. And between them, and as I mentioned in previous audios, between them there's over 10,000 members, and all looking to identify routes to support aspects of their healthcare in different ways. And the teams have sort of looked to highlight some of the most challenging aspects of nephrology or nephrology practice through areas of science, in areas of science as well, in a way that is sort of understood or should hopefully approachable, at least in around and across the public domain. So there's lots of different ways to obviously raise a research profile. First and foremost, it's about ensuring that there's if there's a gap to be bridged in areas of in other industries apart from, for example, healthcare, then it's knowing what those issues are, and where those can be better understood. But in my opinion, nothing really beats putting that context in an academic and sort of in a way of a publication of some kind that actually highlights context in a more profound way, and linking with with that particular a particular area or focuses around in a different industry or those industries. And I want to say that with the RPSG, and I've looked at some of their work on and off, and perhaps more recently, and they've highlighted that they've recently presented, for example, 2 academic poster presentations at the European Society of Pediatric Nephrology, or ESPN, which was held in an area of Europe, and that was one poster presentation was on, I believe, having looked at the work, had a focus around a faith aspect, as well as areas that we're all sort of a focus that we're all quite familiar with, but especially when we've all been going through, for example, the last 18 months to 2 years around the pandemic and COVID-19, and how all of us have been in some way restricted, and also where we've all been following different the guidances according to our different parts of the world. And with these poster presentation, this particular poster presentation focused on that area of that's referred to as sort of coping. So coping and faith was one of the poster presentations, and the other one was about organ donation and transplantation, and how that focus is there a sort of a particular stance on that topic in and around the use of social media and the mainstream media. So the poster presentations were accepted, and they were accepted as poster presentations, and what I'm getting at is poster presentations. If people are, for example, in those industries where presentations are around aspects of visualization as well, or imaging, then at least there should be some link to have academic or a scholarship around a particular focus that is perhaps something that they are more familiar with than those actually in academia. So it makes every bit of sense, really, for academics to learn from that, and also for those in those particular industries to have those again, I'll use the words effective collaborations, and also should help raise those research profiles, those profiles from a research perspective as well, because that then hones in the more holistic perspective of what those people who want to have wanted to, for example, put those perspectives in on paper and have those sort of publications behind them, for example, but either they're saying, for example, there's no time, or there's little time, or it's just not worth their time, for example. So that being said, even though it might not be worth their time because of the duration it might take, for example, if those profiles are again more about image and visualization, then unfortunately that brings a sense of disharmony, because and a sense of, I guess, a sense of dysynchronization, if I can use that word or terminology, because what happens is that they don't really those people or the people in those industries are more likely to be known about how they sort of bring out that side of them more than than maybe perhaps well, whether I should use the word maybe or perhaps, maybe I should what I really want to say or highlight is that how the very nature or focus that they really want to bring out never really gets to be brought out, because those who might be following their works are more about sort of following their sense of flair and image and branding and all of those things. This information, I'm sure, listeners, you are more knowledgeable about that context than I am. So at least in and around perhaps aspects of sort of use of different social media in one way or another. I also followed the works of the RPSG, because they're, again, the Renal Patient Support Group. They've presented kind of a European level, international level, regionally and locally, and collaborations have been quite diverse as well. And the very focuses that for example, the RPSG and even KDARS for kids, the Kidney Disease and Renal Support Group for kids, have focused on retrospectively have sort of, I would think, some sense of place in other industries. For example, where they've collaborated in 2016, there was a poster presentation that they looked at, which was relating to CKD, chronic kidney disease terminology, and the different stages of chronic kidney disease, and also how there can be a risk of misinformation and probably sort of misharmony around between health professionals, use of terminology, and how patients might perceive or have that perspective around those sorts of terminology, leading to not just a sense of disharmony but indifferences, and also a poster presentation on ignorance and discrimination. And now on these things are perhaps very important in other areas of industry, in other industries, sorry. So having and what's being highlighted here is that really no one's should change anything of their practice, but really to integrate aspects of those kinds of examples into their work, so that actually there is more harmony between different areas of industry, different industries, and also, of course, in areas of healthcare more generally. And that's really where we should be all working, where everyone should be working towards, no matter what industry we're in. And that does draw on the examples of the previous two audio and podcasts. One about how to be, one was on how to be an effective research collaborator, and the other, and the one just before this one, was about interprofessional collaborations. We're all very, perhaps in one way or another, people, whatever, regardless of what industries we're working in or whatever areas that we have a focus in, we're perhaps pretty much very used to having interprofessional collaborations in some way or another. But where research is concerned, that is very, though it can be quite arduous. When I've looked at the work again through the RPSG and what they've done over the last decade, I can't really understand how, for example, we're not talking about, for example, kidney disease or that particular long-term condition more so in the public domain. And in literature, for example, at least literature that I've looked at, we still know kidney disease is still, for example, referred to or known as a silent, irreversible long-term condition. And when you look at that particular essence, and also look at the premise of, for example, COVID-19 and how that came about, there's perhaps some similarities, and I won't go into too much around that. But for example, there is the similarity in that they're both silent, and kidney disease, when someone has it, is actually unseen. There's no, someone could have kidney disease but actually look very normal, and dare I use the word normal in this context, because actually really and truly, what is normal. So that sort of understanding needs to be had as part of this audio and sort of podcast as well. So apart from that context, and what I also want to highlight here is about in relating to raising your sort of research profile, is also about aligning objectives to a kind of social media and highlighting awareness around sort of certain aspects of lifestyle, and that to have collaborative efforts and meet on mutual goals and objectives around that is actually, I guess, in one way or another, excuse me, in one way or another, is what every health professional and anyone and everyone in, for example, working around areas of health and technology, for example, is trying to do. But at the same time, there's still a sense of disharmony, because it's what happens, or at least there has been evidences where organizations and perhaps individuals, they benefit more than actually how, for example, the sort of the wealth that's created by these particular efforts don't actually come back into society, and that's nothing new, though, listeners. You'll be aware that there's still disparity in all kinds of aspects of day-to-day of the day-to-day, not least because of the of how COVID-19 has affected people and perhaps daily life. So it's important to find and identify ways to raise your sort of a research profile that comes part and parcel, can be put in part and parcel with the other efforts, because that way it should build a sense of integrity and sort of it also, in one way or another, shows that individuals can be a bit more versatile and agile about aspects of their work, and they're not so restricted so that they are only about their business, for example. So what should also be understood here is that and I'll put this into as part of the next section, really, about sort of how that research, how having a research profile can actually stand to build, can help to not only bring about more a focus around professional development or even continuous professional development, if if there are any healthcare professionals out there listening, that by having that sense of effort linked to areas of industry, for example, or different areas of industry, that also then brings on our possibilities to do more learning and sort of development, and bring on having sort of those efforts bridged across other focuses where there might be disparity. So also can help bridge and align to other sort of networks as well, and if there's positive efforts around mutual sort of mutual and aligned objectives, then that can actually be quite empowering. For me, I have to say, this is something I picked up on a paper publication by Hammock and their team in 2009, as well, and this is quite good. It's a direct quote, and it relates to interprofessionalism as well. So the direct quote is this: being interprofessional is about collaborating in ways that are fit for purpose. Now, that being said, I suppose first and foremost, I probably should have added that into one of the previous audios that was in this the LabZtorm effect audio podcast series. But I put it in here because it is about sort of aligning areas first and foremost, across and in between those industries that are separate in their own ways and working towards their own goals and perhaps their own means, and not so much linking back into society and healthcare more specifically. So being interprofessional is about collaborating in ways that are fit for purpose, and fit for purpose is also about being open to doing things in perhaps in a more dynamic way. So I would encourage the people to check out the works by Hammock and that team in 2009, and you can search their works through an online search, and I will read out a few further resources towards the end of this podcast and audio as well. Now, apart from the sort of the collaborative efforts and collaborations perspective, having a sort of a way to raise a research profile is only going to be as effective as the intention sort of behind that, and those who lead ideas interact and want to sort of bridge sort of those different focuses, so that basically it brings more harmony. I believe that being interprofessional also can sort of bring a different scope or novelty to health practices, and that also shows that the research profile of individuals who do work in that way are not just effective, but they're quite open to doing things with a bit more novelty. I've looked at the work of the Renal Patient Support Group, or the RPSG, and I actually sort of looked at how they've tried to do things with a bit more novelty, and that actually inspired me to actually bring about these audios and podcasts, because I thought to myself, well, being someone who enjoys sort of the written word more than, I suppose, the spoken language, if I can put it in that way, provides opportunity to share knowledge and actually sort of raise others and raise each other. We've all interestingly, I was only just a few days ago watching a bit of that. It's an old film now, I think, and one of the characters in this film says is using a quote taken directly from an author's and a publisher's book, and it was I'm not going to read the whole quote out or anything, but it was saying something on the lines of our deepest fear is that we're not inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. Now, and those who are listening to the audio will probably get a sense of understanding where that's taken from, and which film and which I would like to think which sort of publication is taken from, and therein lies the other problem, because when we see films, for example, which are more about image than about the articulated effort that goes into works, we're going to remember the image and the visualization more than the written words, and that is a problem, because it means that it brings a sense of numbness to our efforts more profoundly, because so for example, if those listeners would know which film I'm on about, for example, I won't name the film, but if for example we're using films and images to kind of get inspired, for example, which in a way is not a bad thing, but if it's and it's not just a bad thing, it's not terrible, but if we're just using those examples to create more works that are that actually bring more kind of have our own take on things, I mean, and that coming from more images or more image or visualization and all of that context, then that actually that is actually, it's not a bad thing, it's not a terrible thing, but it is one-sided. So we need to be I think everyone in one way or another needs to have a sense of bringing context from at least 2 or 3 perspectives to make themselves more robust and sort of add integrity and links really between, if you imagine, for example, a spider's web. I'll use this example as well. If you imagine a spider's web, there's a center part to it, but then before the spider hits the center or has a center, there's lots of different sort of pathways that the spider uses to build that web. Now, that's basically how, you know, as individuals we should be. To build a center, we should have lots of sort of areas and focuses around us, and that, what I'm saying, dear listeners, is not just about the visualization and the images, because that does unfortunately become more about flair, and we're very much, as a human race, we're actually very more we're more about images. It's sort of like bright lights and things like that, that have a sense of trend, and we're more likely to follow things around that, and then that actually, if it doesn't bring disharmony, it's definitely going to continue where people see things from, you know, a one-sided perspective. Even if there is inspiration around that, then certainly articulating in the written, from the written aspect is not part of what part of the individuals who are inspired to want to do, and that for example, I use that example from that particular film, because apart from the different pathways for the spider to kind of draw on before getting to the center, it also means that they have the spider has to work hard, and basically where they have, for example, like between 6 and 8 legs, for example, and they're constantly you know, sort of doing what they need to do to bridge the pathways to get to the center, for example. It should actually, we as a human race in some way should be inspired by that, because by spiders and insects in one way or another, because we because what happens is that if spiders are, for example, able to focus on different ways to kind of bring things to the center, then certainly as a human race, we should be doing the same, and not just focusing on sort of the image and the visualization of things, and making things look you know, really sort of wildly you know, sort of visually sort of you know, sort of kind of attractive, so much so that actually the words on paper and that context is actually doesn't really sort of get get focused. It doesn't get focused, and it doesn't sort of hold as much stance in some, at least because people, for example, generally are more about the sort of visualization and imaging versus words, and so when looking to build a research profile, or build a focus around a research profile, look at the example of spiders and insects who have between 6 and 8 legs, because basically they not just work hard, but they have lots of different focuses that bring that link to they must be, spiders and insects, and in linking with that phrase I used, that quote I used from one of those, a well-known author who had that quote in their works about that we are powerful beyond measure. If you think about the spiders and how insects generally, they have a mutual, there is well, they may not have mutual goals or mutual respect between each other, like spiders versus ants, or ants versus, I don't know, other insects, and etc. They may not have mutual goals, and they may disrespect each other, for example, but they do have there's a central focal point where they all sort of know that sort of makes sense, and so that is where humans sort of have, I don't really want to use the word or terminology negated, but we are also powerful beyond measure, but it's having that mutual sort of understanding that harmony can be achieved by looking at aspects and sort of raising our sort of research profiles as part of what we do on a day-to-day, so that when something comes back to the center, we've actually looked at perspective from more than one or two pathways, or 3 to 5 pathways, or 7 to 8 pathways, or whatever. You basically looked at something from several different perspectives, and that actually is more empowering, and that is how we are generally, I would think, powerful beyond measure. And I think, though I can't remember the exact line from the book or the works, that I think part of that was also part of that quote from those works, is that knowing that we have a sense of power and empowerment also allows us to take a sense of, I guess, ownership in some way, but also we find that we're sharing experiences, and we actually do have a sense of our integrity builds automatically. We don't know that is happening, but also we are liberating each other as well. And I think something about that was in that quote, saying just by, I think towards the end of that quote was, that quote from that author was that the fact that we are there on our own, or we're there as part of an effort, and I don't want to use the word movement in this context. I don't want to say as part of a movement, but I would say that that by those who are sort of making an effort to sort of build bridges and do things more kind of in an integrated fashion. The fact that we're doing that, or people are doing that, and we're there and being there, that should bring us. It should without whether we know it or not, it should be not just liberating in one way or another, but also helps others to sort of understand that there's a center and there's a focal point to any given topic and subject entity, and there's all kinds of avenues to take to actually help raise a research profile, and so that understanding I wanted to highlight there. I also wanted to say that these kinds of things, and in terms of doing one thing, having one focus, and then potentially moving into another focus, but where those focuses are related, for example, it also helps it should offer opportunities to sort of move forward, and the good thing about having opportunities to sort of raise a research profile, having a research profile, is also that those who are collaborating, or where there might be interprofessional collaborations, for example, they are also, whether automatically or in an approached effort, they are co-authors in that work, and that comes back to the point of where we are liberating each other, because by being co-authors in efforts that are to link this and bridge across areas of sort of where there's disparities and inequalities in inequity, and sort of those determinants of poor health, and for example also poor patient experiences and things like that. And those kinds of things, by the way, again, have come out from the Renal Patient Support Group, and I wouldn't be I guess so inspired to talk about these things if I wasn't looking at their works, because I would say for a long time they've been doing these kinds of works, and it's really quite inspirational, and so this also brings on to the pretty much the final point I want to make now, and that is to say that where there's those efforts and being a co-author in sort of academic scholarship type work or scholarly work, that should offer collaborations to be more effective across different areas, sort of more broadly. And most efforts should then integrate between areas of what what people are primarily sort of interested in or intrigued by, and then linked with areas of healthcare and for example the public domain, thus bridging and centralizing things more, I suppose, back to aspects of faith, because when things become centered or centric, then faith actually, in some regard, and dare I use this terminology, say that it's restored, it's more that it gets perhaps reignited, and excuse me, and then excuse me, and then when faith gets reignited, then compassion and kind of becomes more instilled. So having sort of publications as part of different efforts that individuals or teams are doing, irrespective of what industries they're in, that's quite important, or should be. And again, it helps us understand our differences. And that being said, listeners will know, for example, I'm sure that there are workshops and seminars and things that they can go to help build a basis for their sort of development and sort of assurance around different aspects of work. And ultimately, these help to build not just the integrity aspect, but also help to explore different ways to raise that sort of research profile, and how how collaborative efforts can be more integrated, effective, and actually perhaps more meaningful. I'm going to stop on that note, and just going to highlight a few resources, references, and then that will be the end of this particular audio podcast. So I'm going to say this it's a reflective practice model, and it's quite a good one. It's by Kolb in 1984, and it's about experimental learning, experience as the source of learning and development, and that was a book publication. Publishers are in New Jersey. It's quite a dated publication, but if you put in Kolb in the search engine, that will come up with kind of the reflective practice model and what it looks like, and listeners can kind of look to implement that in aspects of their work. There's also I think I made mention of this before, but I'll mention it again. There's LabZtorm in 2003 came up with a works. It's a book chapter in a book, models for interprofessional collaborations, and it was in LabZtorm, interprofessional collaboration from policy to practice in health and social care, and it's in a Philadelphia publication, and there's a few works by the RPSG team, the Renal Patient Support Group, the RPSG. Their work in 2014 was probably the first and foremost go-to paper publication, and that's by Mohammed and colleagues in 2014, the Renal Patient Support Group, supporting patients with chronic kidney disease through social media, and it was a Journal of Renal Care publication in 2014. There was also a really nice publication by Mohammed and the team in 2016, coping in young people with chronic kidney disease, and that's also published in the Journal of Renal Care as well. There is a paper publication. It's in the British Medical Journal, or BMJ, and it's by Rawlinson in 2008. And this paper is quite a good read, an overview, sort of an overview on aspects of healthcare, but focuses on harms of target-driven healthcare. And apart from those, I do want to highlight that again, this podcast audio was is about how to raise a sort of research profile, and I'm going to use the example of the renal patient support group, where they've published quite extensively, and their research profile sort of is on something called ResearchGate. It is actually a research profile, a social media platform where academics and researchers sort of collaborate and network, and it's actually quite a good sort of publication, a publication platform really, as well, because those who might not be familiar with academia or research can have profiles and research profiles on there, and then they can actually stand to look to collaborate potentially, and link with in areas of academia research where they which might be completely foreign to them, but will certainly help with bringing another paradigm and dynamic to areas that they might be for example stand up for, and that's one of the main ones. There is also other sort of research profiles, other ways to raise a research profile. If there are academics out there listening to this, then knowing that it's important to be able to cross those areas of disparity by linking into different areas of industry, so that people can actually stand to learn in sort of, I would like to say, in a more of a from a real time perspective, so that so everyone generally feels a bit more liberated, which is, I think, everything what everyone really wants to kind of have, and that's where I'm going to draw a close on this particular audio and podcast. I want to say thank you for listening. The next one, and it will be the final audio and podcast in this particular series, and that will be on project management, and it will be a review, and in that work, in that sort of paper publication, or in that particular audio, I will highlight sort of different ways that people can sort of task and project manage, and it will be kind of an overview of that subject, and hopefully it will prompt some intrigue, and I hope you've enjoyed this series, at least to this extent. I will be bringing out another series in the coming days or weeks, and that will be hopefully another chance to interact, and kind of link efforts between different areas, or at least highlight some more examples. So I just want to say thank you again. This is the Shientist, and you've been listening to the LabZtorm Effect series, and this was on raising this audio podcast was on raising your research profile, and it's been another Storm Lobostics production, and hopefully catch you again on the next one. Thank you again for listening. Take care. Have a good one.